Welcome to episode 319 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Mario Tariche and former agent Raquel Rocky Cicini. In part one of this two-part episode, Mario and Rocky review their investigation of Willy Falcon, Sal Magluta, aka the Cocaine Cowboys, and others, which resulted in the dismantlement of the largest drug trafficking organization in South Florida and provided the evidence of jury tampering and bribery in the acquittal verdict received in a prior DEA drug case against their subjects. The case was codenamed Operation RECOIL. However, it has been memorialized as Cocaine Cowboys, King of Miami from the Netflix series by the same name, during which Mario and Rocky were interviewed. Mario Tariche served in the FBI for 30 years. He was assigned to the New York division where he worked drug trafficking cases and background investigations, the Miami Division's Key West resident agency, and the Miami Division headquarters city to work on public corruption matters and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Mario served as the supervisor of the Public Corruption Task Force for 5 years and as the FBI Deputy On-Scene Commander for the Regime Crimes Liaison Office in Baghdad, Iraq, responsible for the trial of Saddam Hussein and the investigation of high-ranking Ba'ath Party officials for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Additionally, he served in Afghanistan during 2 rotations and for the Afghanistan Major Crimes Task Force. He also worked international money laundering and international anti-corruption matters at the FBI Legal Attaché Office in Bucharest and at the Coordination Center in London, where he worked closely with the Five Eye Alliance partners. Mario has received numerous awards and commendations, to include the Director's Award for Distinguished Service to the Law Enforcement Community and the Attorney General's Award for Excellence in Law Enforcement. Additionally, he received 6 outstanding law enforcement awards from the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Florida for work conducted on significant cases, and the Combat Theater Award for service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Prior to retiring, he served 2 terms on the Executive Council and as the co-chair for the Director's Special Agent Advisory Committee. Since his retirement, Mario has been working as a contract senior financial investigator for the Criminal Investigative Division, International Corruption Squad, working out of the Miami Division. Rocky Cicini served in the FBI for 11 years. Prior to joining the FBI, she was a homicide detective. She spent her career in the Miami field office investigating high-profile corruption cases of political figures, corrupt law enforcement officials, and government employees. During her FBI career, Rocky became a certified instructor and crisis negotiator for the Critical Incident Response Group. Her expertise was invaluable in training local police departments and participating in domestic and international critical incidents. During her career, her outstanding contributions were honored with prestigious awards such as the Attorney General and the Drug Enforcement Administrator's Award. Additionally, she has been bestowed with numerous accolades from the Southern District United States Attorney Office and State Attorney. Her last assignment was as the coordinator of the Miami office's confidential file room, where she ensured that human intelligence sources were adequately vetted and beneficial to the FBI's mission. She remained in this position until she became a stay-at-home mom focused on caring for her special needs daughter. Rocky continues to apply her extensive experience and expertise as a security consultant, working alongside her husband, retired FBI agent Joe Cicini. Together, they founded the 1811 Group, a Miami-based boutique security consulting firm that specializes in risk mitigation for high net worth individuals, families, and corporations. During this episode, Mario and Rocky give shout-outs to retired agents Sam Smimo, Michael J. Anderson, and Jack Garcia, all previous guests on FBI Retired Case File Review, who played major roles in the investigation. Next week, I'll post part 2 of this 2-part episode. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agents Mario Tariche and Raquel Cicini, also known as Rocky. So welcome, Mario, and welcome, Rocky.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Jerry.
Well, this is going to be a real treat for everyone because I can't imagine that there is anyone listening to this episode who has not watched the Netflix show Cocaine Cowboys. And you two are stars of the series. So we're going to be able to go through that whole case on this episode. And I'm hoping if there were things that you were interviewed about on the series that ended up on the cutting room floor, or if there were things that maybe somebody else who was on the series said that you disagreed with, that this will be the opportunity for you to talk about it. As you introduce the subjects of this episode, could you talk a little bit about the music and the videos that have kind of elevated this case?
Yeah, so funny story. And actually, this is a very serious case, so I don't like to tell too many funny stories, but I was recently doing a presentation on this case about Salvador Magluta and Willy Falcon about the investigation to law enforcement. And the law enforcement said, have you seen the latest video that's been released involving Willy Falcon? It's a rap song by Rick Ross. And I said, no, I haven't seen it. Let me watch it. So then they ended up showing me the video. So I was kind of surprised to see Willy Falcon in a rap video. And additionally, the music to, I'm a big, Pitbull fan. So when we first started watching the Netflix series and the theme song was from Pitbull, I thought that was very unique to have that song as a theme song for the Netflix series. Also, Rocky and I were recently discussing that we had gone on to social media and seen there was a lot of social media chatter and a movement of the Free Sal Magluta movement, I think it's called, online. And as we tell this story, I think your listeners will realize that maybe this social media movement is a little bit misguided because of all the serious crimes committed by this organization. And Rocky and I are going to be telling your listeners the story. And I think, Jerry, to hold out Salvador Magluta and Willy Falcon as some sort of heroes of the community is just not accurate and a bit misguided. And I think after your listeners listen to our summary of the case, I think that they'll agree with me and Rocky.
Who wants to start? Where are we starting?
I think I can start, Jerry. I know there's a lot of interest in this case after the Netflix series Cocaine Cowboys, Kings of Miami was released in 2021. And a little background on that. The Netflix series, I want to say in approximately 2010, Alfred Spellman reached out to me. His documentary company that he runs with Billy Corben had done 2 previous documentaries, Cocaine Cowboys 1 and Cocaine Cowboys 2, and they were interested in doing a 3rd documentary on the whole Falcon Magluta case. And during our initial meeting, I was very impressed with the staff and the knowledge that they had at the case. They had all of the trial transcripts, and they had a lot of, through Freedom of Information Act requests, a lot of information from the case reports, investigative reports, and the initial meetings went very, very well. And I think they ran into the same problem that we're probably going to have today, is that it's just a long story. It's a long case. So instead of doing a 90-minute documentary, they decided to do a 6-part series, which was eventually ended up on Netflix. And that's the famous series that everybody has seen about our case. So I was interviewed initially in around 2010, 2011. I know Rocky was interviewed much later. Rocky, when were you interviewed?
2019.
2019.
So I looked a lot older than you.
That's why I looked a little young during my interview. And I even told Alfred, I said there was times where they thought, Rocky and I were lying, that there was actually going to be a documentary series because it took so long before it aired. But the final product was outstanding. And I think the whole investigative team and the prosecutors, everybody thought that they did a fantastic job with the series.
I know it was one of the top shows on Netflix for a long period of time. I mean, I was trying to get you to come on the podcast back then, but because of your busy schedule, I think you started a new job. It's taken a while for us to pull this together, but I'm just so pleased to have you and Rocky here.
Well, thank you, Jerry. We appreciate the opportunity to tell the story about this unique case. But I think the best way to start it is maybe giving your audience a little bit of background on the case. So the Falcon Magluta organization was one of the largest drug trafficking organizations probably in the history of South Florida. The criminal activity of the organization spanned from the late 1970s all the way into the early 90s. And then after the early 90s, of course, was the trial and further criminal activity. So really, the criminal activity spanned over 3 decades, over 30 years. So it's a very complicated, unique case. But around the time where Falcon and Magluta were arrested by the DEA, I think that was in around 1991. And the DEA had investigated this organization for many, many years. I can mention a few of the case agents: Dave Bora, Jane Engelstead, Mike Baker. I mean, the DEA did an incredible job of investigating this organization. So once they were arrested, DEA was very confident that they were going to convict them at the trial. And we'll talk about later why it took so long for the trial to actually happen after the 91 arrest. The trial actually didn't start until 1996. So after Falcon and Magluta went to trial in 1996, to the shock of everybody in the community, they were found not guilty. So after being found not guilty, as you can imagine, the prosecutors, the DEA agents, everybody was shocked with this verdict. They thought for sure, with all the evidence in this case, that it would be a guilty verdict. So that's the background of where we came into the case. And of course, they were known as, at that time, as Los Muchachos. They were very famous in South Florida. The DEA case had shown that they imported into the United States over 78 tons of cocaine, which we all know was a conservative estimate. It probably was a lot more than 78 tons and well over $2 billion with cocaine distributed in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Miami. And the media was all over this case, and they called it the impossible victory, the dream team of attorneys that represented Falcone and Magluta. And the government at that time unfairly took a lot of criticism in the media that they had put on a bad case. At that time, we didn't know what was going on in the background. So this is a shock to the community. And Rocky knows the story of the U.S. Attorney Kendall Coffey, who was unfortunately caught in an incident after the acquittal. I don't know if I believe everything that he was accused of, but at that time, it was all over the media that prosecutors had gone to a famous bar, Tobacco Road, for some drinks. And following having drinks at Tobacco Road, Kendall Coffey, the U.S. attorney, ended up at a well-known strip club and was accused of biting a stripper at that time. So that was another thing that the U.S. attorney's office was dealing with. So this was all over the media at this time, Jerry. And at that time, I was stationed in Key West with the FBI, and I had worked some cases with Pat Sullivan and Guy Lewis, who were prosecutors in Miami. So in January 1997, I got transferred up to the Miami office. And my first week in the office, I had a meeting with my supervisor, Mike Clemens. And Mike Clemens was an outstanding field supervisor, very experienced. And he told me about this case. Had I heard of this Falcon Magluta case? And I told him the only thing I really knew was what I had read in the newspapers about the case. So Mike said, I had spoken to Pat Sullivan and Guy Lewis, some prosecutors, and they had suggested that maybe FBI can send somebody to the U.S. Attorney's Office for a meeting to see if FBI could join this investigation. So I always tell the story. I went to this meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office with Pat Sullivan, Guy Lewis. I think Paul Pelletier was another one of the prosecutors who was there at the time. And the meeting was very serious. There's a very serious tone at that time going on at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And when they laid out the case, what they thought had happened, which led to the acquittal, I was really shocked. I'd never seen any criminal activity of this magnitude.
I was going to ask you before you go on, because there are going to be some people here who don't understand the magnitude of an acquittal. They have all of this evidence and, about the cocaine and the money laundering and the drug dealing and all of this stuff. And the defendants are acquitted. Explain again what that means as far as this evidence is concerned.
Well, so after a lengthy investigation by the DEA, this case eventually went to trial in 1996. And like I said, the prosecutors, Chris Clark and Pat Sullivan, were very experienced prosecutors. The evidence was overwhelming. Now, to their credit, the defense counsel was also very formidable in that case. You had some really high-profile defense attorneys who did do a great job cross-examining a lot of the cooperators, like happens in most of our trials. However, there was so much overwhelming evidence that the government really felt that it was going to be a guilty verdict in the case. So when the entire jury, all 12 jurors, came back with a not guilty verdict, the government was shocked. The entire community was shocked. How could 12 jurors come up with a not guilty verdict in that case? And Rocky and I will explain to you what led to that not guilty verdict.
Yeah, what I was asking about was, it's an acquittal. So what are you going over to the U.S. Attorney's Office for? It's over. No matter what, they can never, ever recharge these two with the same charges ever again because they've been acquitted.
Yeah, it's, when you have a momentous event like that, where you had an enormous amount of evidence and a defendant is found not guilty, it shows that it's a failure of the prosecution to prove their guilt, So it was just a shock. And the magnitude of that acquittal was very upsetting. And especially with a organization like Willy and Sal, that they were very popular in the community. And the significance of that verdict was, it was shockwave. And everyone suspected something happened.
Jerry, the legal question, too, would have been interesting, because had we proved up sooner or at that time that the jury was bought off, like we later were able to prove, then possibly they could have been tried again for the same charges. But that was a complicated legal matter to do it that way. So the prosecutors believed the better way to do it would be to just start a new case and charge obstruction of justice, jury tampering, witness tampering, money laundering charges. It was a cleaner, easier way to charge them, and essentially they'd get the same sentence.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense.
So after my initial meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I went back to the FBI office to report back to Mike Clemens. And Mike Clemens had already spoken with the prosecutors to get a background on the case. And although it was my first week there on my new squad, I was on a public corruption squad there, busy public corruption squad in Miami, and they had a lot of cases going on already. So Mike felt that it made sense to assign me as a new agent on the squad to the investigation. And I spoke Spanish, so I would be able to communicate with witnesses on the case. After the follow-up meeting with Mike, I get assigned to the case. Mike Clemens had a vision of this case and how to tackle a really large case like this, Jerry, where he knew there was going to be multiple facets of this case that had to be investigated. So we started to build up our team for the case. And one of the first people we added to the case was a new agent who just was out of the academy. And I'll let Rocky give a little bit of background on how she got involved in the case.
Well, I was a new agent in the Miami field office. I had graduated in November of 1996, and I was doing my 3 months of applicants when Mike Clemens called over and introduced himself and said he works for the Public Corruption Squad and he wanted to have a conversation with me, see if I would be interested in coming to his squad because he thinks he has a perfect case for me to be involved in. So I met Clemens and he sat in the office and he started talking about Willy and Sal. And he's like, not sure if you're familiar with them. I said, yes, I am familiar with them. I, was a Hialeah cop. I was a homicide detective in Hialeah. And I had heard about all the stories, in Miami of all the murders going on and the whole thing with Kendall Coffee. So, I knew of the case, but I hadn't worked it as a police officer. And he said, I'd like to bring you on to this to work the homicides. I work with Miami-Dade and Miami PD with homicide part of this investigation. I said, sure, I'd love to. And that's how I was added to the team. But I didn't know Mario felt a little hesitant about that. So he could tell you that part.
Jerry, when Mike first told me we're going to bring a new agent onto the case, you know how the older case agents are, well, a new agent, we're going to have to show her the paperwork, show her how we do everything in the FBI. And that's going to be another thing that we're going to have to worry about. And we're going to be super busy. But as you know, the FBI does such a great job recruiting former military and former police officers into the FBI. So those are the type of agents that can really hit the ground running on day one. And Raquel had previously been a homicide detective. So her experience as a police officer allowed her from day one, on the case to really be a contributor to the team. So we were very lucky to add Rocky to the team. And then also another young agent who I know Jerry, he's done one of your episodes is Mike Anderson. He was another agent we added to the team. And Mike was another young agent, only about 2 years in, but Mike was an accountant and a lawyer, had an expertise in financial investigations. So Mike Clemens did a very good job in building the team. And one of the important things, Jerry, in the case was the entire investigative team. We had tremendous support, not only from our field supervisors, which would have been Mike Clemens and later Gary Favita, but executive management in the office. Our SAC at that time was Hector Pesquera. We had support from the U.S. Attorney's Office, from FBI headquarters. I mean, this was a case where the defendants had really obstructed the original case and they had really attacked the American justice system. So everybody was on the same page and we had a lot of support, which was really important because as this investigation moved forward, we had to use a lot of resources in the case. So that was extremely important. And like in all cases, one of the fun things that Raquel and I had to do was come up with a name for the operation. So we went back and forth, different names, and we finally came up with Operation RECOIL, which stood for Racketeering, Executions, Corruption, Obstruction of Justice, Intimidation of Witnesses, and Laundering of Money. And we had, Raquel could probably tell the story about her brother did a pencil drawing of a snake portraying the government like recoiling back and striking back at the organization in the case. Go ahead, Rocky.
Yeah, my brother, he's very artistic. So I said, hey, Mario, I can get my brother to draw something for us and let's see what it looks like. He didn't know anything about the case. I just said, hey, I need a favor. I need a logo. Can you just draw like a cobra or something recoiling like they were getting ready to strike for me? And he did. And he did it very quickly. And I showed it to Mario. He goes, oh, I like that. And then Mario took it to a graphic designer who kind of tweaked it and added the colors in it. And that's how we got the symbol for Operation RECOIL. So all in the family.
Yeah, very good. Do you happen to have an image of that? I'd love to add it to the show notes for this episode.
Yes, we can send it to you.
Yeah, send that. That'd be great. You mentioned Mike Anderson, and I was able to interview him several years ago. I don't even know
Right.
when that was, probably in 2019 and he did episode 134.
Yeah, we listened to it.
So it was just on the jury bribery part, the obstruction of justice with one of the jurors, only that part. And so what we're going to be doing today is expanding to the whole case. But definitely, when we come to that, we can go through that quickly. But anybody listening, if they want to get an understanding of what happened with the main juror, the foreman, they can listen to episode 134.
We've now put together our team. We've met with management at the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have our investigative strategy. I had an initial meeting with the investigative team, which was the Miami-Dade homicide detectives, City of Miami homicide detectives, and DEA agents, U.S. Marshals Service, all the investigative team that had been working on the case. Luckily, at the initial meeting, I had Pat Sullivan with me, and Pat Sullivan at that time was a very, very highly respected prosecutor in the community. He had prosecuted Manuel Noriega and the Miami River cops corruption case and many other high-profile cases. So as long as I had Pat Sullivan with me, I think I was welcomed by the investigative team. But there was some apprehension in the beginning to bringing FBI into the case because they had worked together for many years. And actually, the state homicide investigators had their own cases, and they still needed to be convinced to bring these cases under one federal indictment, which would be better for the overall case. And I think the detectives realized that it would be better for their cases to go federal than state. So it took a little bit of convincing in the beginning, Jerry, but I think everybody was on the same page that we really needed to bring all our resources together and not have any infighting between agencies if we wanted to be successful in the case. So once we had everything set with the team, then at that same time, what was going on, Jerry, is after the acquittal, so your audience knows, Falcone and Magluta were not just set free. So Falcone, during the search warrant of his residence out in Fort Lauderdale, when he was arrested, he was caught with an illegal gun. So the government quickly re-indicted him on a gun charge. So he was still in jail. And when Magluta was arrested, he had some fake passports and other identification documents on him. So he was charged with those violations. But unfortunately, that was not enough to keep him in jail. So he was released on bond. But he was also on trial. So and the government moved quickly to charge them and moved quickly to have these cases tried so they could get them in jail as quickly as possible, because we knew we needed time to investigate the other cases. So in the middle of the passport case, Magluta finds out that the FBI now is investigating this case, and it's only a matter of time before all the obstruction of justice violations are discovered by law enforcement. So he decides to flee in the middle of his trial on the passport charges. So myself and Rocky and our team, were already doing our investigation, and now he's fled. So the U.S. Marshals Service, we had some great deputy U.S. Marshals we worked with, Sam Smimo, who later became an FBI agent, Joe Gotts, Mike Moran, and many others. They just did an outstanding job, Jerry, of tracking Magluta. He had fled. We thought if he was smarter, he would have fled to Colombia or somewhere where it would be more difficult to find him. But he had fled to Palm Beach and was hiding out in the Palm Beach area. And one of the hotels he was staying at was the Ritz-Carlton. And he brought some attention to himself by flashing money at the Ritz-Carlton. And the marshals got some tips that he was in the area, and they were able to track him down and arrest him. And when they arrested him, he had this really funny-looking wig on him, and the Marshal Service turned that over to us for evidence. We still have that wig in evidence at the FBI office. But during that period of time, also, Willy Falcon was convicted on the gun charge. And Willy Falcon was looking at about 10 years. And after Magluta was arrested and convicted in the passport case, they also charged him with bond jumping. So he was looking at a 9-year sentence in that case. And the important part of the passport case was we needed the U.S. Attorney's Office to really work on getting him a longer sentence on the bond jumping and the passport charges, because the FBI needed time to conduct our investigation. And it would be better if both of them were incarcerated while we finish our investigation. So that's when the team brought on Mike Davis for the first time to work on the sentencing for Magluta in the passport case. And Mike would become one of the most important members of our team. And he did an outstanding job on the sentencing of Magluta to get him the 9 years, to give the FBI some breathing room now. So now we had some time to conduct our investigation. And like I said earlier, the investigation was broken up into 3 parts, which would have been the murders of government witnesses, jury tampering, and then the overall obstruction of justice investigation, which included witness tampering, money laundering, jury tampering, and any other obstruction of justice acts which resulted in the not guilty verdict.
Was there a way that it was divided among the agents involved, say you and Rocky and Mike Anderson? Did you each have your own areas of responsibility?
Yes, so Mike Anderson was in charge of the jury tampering part of the case, but it's important to say as a 2-year agent for Mike Anderson, it was important to team him up with a senior investigator. And we had a senior financial investigator from the IRS, a senior special agent, I should say, Dennis Donnell, who was very experienced. And he teamed up with Mike Anderson. Of course, our forensic accountants, who are important in any financial investigation. We had a great forensic accountant, Jennifer Richardson, who joined Mike Anderson on that part of the case. And then Rocky was in charge of the homicides. And then I was in charge of the overall obstruction of justice case, which I just explained was the witness tampering and the money laundering and all the other obstruction of justice violations. And I think, Jerry, probably the easiest way for us to tell this story of the case is to break it up into different parts, just like we did the investigation. So Rocky was in charge, because of her background and experience, was in charge of the murders of government witnesses, a part of the investigation, which was very important to liaison with the city of Miami detectives and Miami-Dade detectives in charge of that investigation. So I'll let Rocky speak on that.
Jerry, to give the listeners an idea, I know from watching Hollywood and what have you, when we hear hit team, they think that hit teams are like these trained assassins. And our hit team, they were just street level thugs looking to try to make money. And over a period of about 5 or 6 years, the government witnesses were being murdered. The first one started with the attorney, Juan Acosta, who was scheduled to testify before the grand jury about all this money laundering, offshore accounts. And he was killed by a group of basic street level members that were hired by a Colombian mayo in Colombia. And they came in and they did their job, but then they were also assigned to do other attempted murders, and they failed on a couple of them. So there was multiple teams of hitmen. So I want the listeners to really understand that this was not something where they were these trained assassins. These were just low-level guys that were looking for a way to make extra money. So when Juan Acosta was killed, they had come into his office, and there was also a female there who was a legal assistant at the time. And they came in and they shot him, killed him, and they debated a little bit whether they wanted to kill her, and they did, and they took her driver's license. I wasn't at the trial when Mario heard her testimony, but she's still traumatized by what she had witnessed. And then after Juan Acosta, they ended up killing another witness, Luis Escobedo. He was outside of a Coconut Grove club. Then there was Bernie Gonzalez and his brother, who happened to be there at the time. And then there were attempted murders of Tony Posada. There was attempted murder of Lazaro Cruz and attempted murder of Juan Barroso. All of these individuals were part of the Falcon and Magluta organization. So it didn't take rocket science to figure out that somebody within this organization, and most likely Sal, was organizing or directing to get rid of these witnesses, because he didn't want to go to jail.
And he knew for sure that they had all decided to cooperate with the investigation?
Initially, in the beginning, they did not know that there was a cooperator who, Juan Carrera, who was part of the murder of Juan Acosta. He had reached out to detectives before being deported. He was sitting in jail for some other unrelated offense, and he did not want to get deported. And he wanted to cooperate and provide information on the Acosta murder. And that was, I believe, was Detective Ilhart was working that murder from Miami. And before he could contact ICE, they had deported him. They lost contact for a few years. And then he wanted to come back to the United States and wanted to cooperate. And they tried to get him over to cooperate. He provided some information. They kind of felt that they knew he was cooperating. So while he was in Colombia, they stabbed him. And the DEA eventually were able to fly him out and bring him back to the United States. He was charged, but it was kept covertly. So they did not know that there was a cooperator, and we were getting a lot of information. The city of Miami and Miami-Dade County were getting a lot of information about these government witnesses being murdered. He had a lot of information. So, eventually the murder investigations, city of Miami and Miami-Dade had already worked the homicide. On the day of, they follow their leads, they do interviews, they try to tie people up. They already knew these witnesses were part of Falcon Magluta organization. It was common knowledge, but tying the organization to putting out the hits is where they were stuck and nobody was talking. They did go visit Javier Cadena, who was in jail, and he would not cooperate, and nobody was talking or saying who hired them. So the only one they had at the time was Juan Carrera. So, eventually we were able to negotiate and speak with them. I interviewed Javier Cadena. I interviewed the Caicedo brothers, Tuberquia, so all of them. And eventually they all came around. They all started wanting to cooperate. Many of them wanted to go into the Witness Security Protection Program. And that was one of the things that we promised them, that they would have protection if they cooperated. Because especially like with Juan Carrera, they already knew he had been stabbed because he was talking about the hits and the organization. And we began putting them into the witness protection, and they're getting their assumed names. And eventually in 1999, there was indictments of 6 subjects that were involved in the murders and the attempted murders. We had a total of 5 cooperating witnesses, and they entered pleas, and a total of 12 subjects were convicted in the murders and the attempted murders.
Yeah, and Jerry, just so your listeners understand, I talked earlier about, a meeting I had at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the very beginning of this case. In South Florida, we had never seen any case like this where witnesses were literally being, murdered in the streets of Miami by professional hit teams that came from Colombia. I think the only thing similar we had seen is maybe like a mob case out of New York City where witnesses were killed. But this was highly, highly unusual to have federal government witnesses killed like this. It was a bit of a shock to law enforcement, and it really helped to bring everybody together to send, a message back to the organization that we were going to investigate these homicides and they were going to hold everybody involved accountable on these cases. So once a few of the hit team members started getting arrested, and Rocky spoke about one of the cooperators, then the case started to come together, and City of Miami, Miami-Dade worked very closely with the FBI, which resulted in an indictment of 6 individuals involved in the homicides, along with our cooperators who also had to plead guilty in the case. And then the case was indicted in 1999, August 1999, around that time. And we started to prepare for the trial. And the prosecutors assigned to that case were Alan Kaiser, Pat Sullivan, and Mike Davis. So we had a very formidable group of prosecutors assigned to the case. And of course, City of Miami Police Department, Miami-Dade Police Department detectives, DEA, and FBI, all were helping out with this trial. This was going to be a big trial, Jerry, because the defendants on trial would get life sentences if convicted at the trial.
Let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. These murders of these witnesses, were these witnesses killed during the charges and arrest, the initial ones where the case was acquitted, or were these fresh murders having to do with the new FBI task force investigation?
They were murders that started once DEA made their arrest. It spanned in that 5-year period before Sal and Willy went to trial before the jury foreman. So they were being killed during different years in that 5-year span, and then they went to trial. So it was Acosta was killed in 89, and Sal was arrested by the DEA in 1991. And it was after his arrest in 91 that they started to kill the government witnesses up until I believe the last homicide was the brothers, or was in, I believe, in 1993.
So for the DEA's case, they stuck to the drug charges while the Miami-Dade and Miami Police Department, the local police, were working on the homicide investigation.
Correct. And Pat Diaz from Miami-Dade, he did an outstanding job organizing and following up on leads, as well as we had City of Miami. Calver was working with us. Ilhart had done an amazing job on the Juan Acosta murder. And so they were doing their typical homicide investigation separate from the DEA case of the drug trafficking. So they were looking to get state charges of murder.
Yes. And Jerry, that's why Rocky had mentioned, the importance of the witness security program, which was an investigative tool that I had not used before as an investigator. And we knew with the witnesses this time, whether they were in jail or whether they were out on the streets, that we had to make sure that no more witnesses were going to be killed in this case. So we had to work closely with the U.S. Marshals Service to get access to the witness security program for our witnesses. So that was a tremendous help to us because the FBI, we just don't have the resources to protect witnesses while a trial or an investigation is pending. So the use of the federal witness security program was very important to us in this case.
It was also used to secure the families in Colombia. We got to work in getting family members brought over here to the United States as part of the deal as well. It wasn't just protecting the cooperators. They wanted their families protected because that's how they would get to them. To silence them was to hurt their families. So it was I don't know, maybe like 30, I think, we had to put into the program. So
it was probably over 30.
Over 30 probably. So yeah, the U.S. Marshals did a fantastic job with that. We had to have the cooperators in protective custody in different jails and prisons. Yeah, it was a lot. And we were so busy working the case that it was great to have them helping us on that side of the house.
And this trial after the 99 indictment, and throughout this investigation, Jerry, remember, we have trials going on and investigation going on at the same time. So we were constantly scrambling with discovery issues, getting witnesses ready for trial. But at the same time, we have federal wiretaps up, undercover operations. We have informants making recordings. So we really needed a team of investigators in this investigation. And starting this trial, on trial for the organization, one of the main subject of the case was Eddie Lascano. Now, Eddie Lascano was the brother-in-law of Salvador Magluta. And we had evidence that Eddie Lascano had met personally with different hit team members from 2 different hit teams that had been sent from Colombia. And Eddie Lascano was responsible for providing them with the names of the witnesses, the addresses, whatever money that they needed for expenses, and any logistics information they needed about the houses, where they were living, who they were. So he was going to be the main subject on the case. We had 2 other defendants in the case, Yubi Ramirez and Jairo Castro, who were less involved in the homicides, but they were involved in the conspiracy and probably shouldn't have gone to trial in the first place, but they were at that trial along with Eddie Lascano. And it was a long trial. From what I remember, it was over 2 months, I believe, the trial. And the main defense counsel for the organization at that trial was Richard Sharpstein. He was representing Eddie Lascano at the trial. And in the community, everybody knew Richard Sharpstein Jerry. He was a very well-known defense attorney. In fact, if you were an agent and you were in trouble, or a police officer who got in trouble, he would probably be the defense attorney in Miami that you'd go to represent you. I know he represented a lot of law enforcement officers over the years. He was a tremendously skilled defense attorney, and we knew that he was going to absolutely destroy the cooperating witnesses in this case, which he did. And I was telling Raquel earlier when we were talking about the trial is I was amazed how Richard Sharpstein would just sit and listen to the prosecutors do the questioning of the defendants. And I didn't even see him taking notes during the questioning by the prosecutors. And he would just get up off his chair with no notes and cross-examine the witnesses for hours. He was an extremely skilled defense attorney. So we were a little worried, as the trial went forward, because Richard Sharpstein was doing such a good job. But the detectives on the case, the homicide detectives, the DEA, FBI, had done a really good job putting this case together. So luckily, in the end, after all the evidence was presented, there was a guilty verdict on the case of all three of them. And all three defendants received life sentences as a result of being convicted in the case.
Jerry, so for those who have watched the Willy and Sal Cocaine Cowboys series, they didn't really cover a lot about Lezcano's role in the organization. So it was led to believe that there was really not a connection to these murders to Willy and Sal. Eddie Lezcano was Sal's brother-in-law, okay? He operated the cell phone company that every drug person in this organization had cell phones from. So he was not just some brother-in-law and wasn't involved in the organization. He had a front. They had a front. He owned the cell phone company, and that's where all the cell phones came from. So he was a big part of the organization, and the hit team members had met with him, and they collected money from him, and they were able to identify him. So I doubt he acted alone. He was a brother-in-law for Sal, and no one did anything in that organization without Sal's blessing, without his approval. It wasn't just people arbitrarily doing stuff to help Sal. Sal was the boss. And then when you have an organization the same as the mob, you don't do anything without the boss's permission. So that's the part in that show where they didn't really cover a lot of what Lezcano's role was, because he was tied to the murders, and they wanted to kind of show some distance between that Sal wasn't connected to the murders.
So in this particular trial in October of 2001, Sal was not charged with these murders.
No, not for this trial. This was a separate indictment. Sal Magluta was part of the indictment for the homicides. However, he was not part of this trial. He had been severed away from the other defendants in this case. And his trial, which we'll talk about later, he gets tried on the murder charges later in the investigation by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office.
That's what I was wondering. Okay.
Right. And speaking of, as Raquel described, the involvement of Eddie Lezcano, the brother-in-law of Magluta, Jerry, he's an example of somebody in the organization who's just extremely loyal. Obviously, he's family, extremely loyal to Magluta. So he's somebody who's going to be very difficult to convince to cooperate with the investigation. And he was the direct link to Magluta in ordering the homicides and deciding which witnesses were going to be killed. Looking back on it, now that he has his life sentence, I think that he probably regrets, not cooperating in the investigation. He'd probably be out of jail today. But by him not cooperating, it was very difficult for the homicide detectives to get a direct link to Sal Magluta in the homicides. There was still a lot of other evidence linking Magluta through Eddie Lezcano, but we didn't have that direct link between the hit team members, Eddie Lezcano, and then Sal Magluta to ordering the hits. And in this whole case, it followed a pattern, Jerry, where we would approach somebody and we would try and solicit cooperation. And many times it didn't work because the organization members were very loyal, and Sal Magluta was very careful in who he dealt with. A lot of them were family members, friends of his that he'd known for many years. So then the next phase, of course, would be the arrest indictment phase. And then we would try to move as quickly as we could into the trial phase, where then subjects would be convicted at trial and then facing lengthy sentences. And at that point was where we would get cooperation in the cases. But it was a very difficult process going through all those steps. We were lucky in a few instances that we got some cooperation initially, but we usually had to go through that whole process that I just explained and get the cooperation after the conviction at trial. And traditionally, the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't really even want to hear from defendants after they've been convicted at trial. But in this case, we had to make an exception because we needed information from some of these defendants to continue to move forward the investigation. So that's an overview of the murders of government witnesses, but there was one defendant charged in the indictment that I thought we should mention, Rocky, which was the Colombian subject who was actually in charge of both of the different hit teams that came down from Colombia. They came through New York and also through Miami. And that was an individual known as Tocayo. That's all we knew his name to be. During the investigation, we later identified him as an individual from Colombia named Grisaldino Carvajal. And we had sent provisional arrest warrants to Colombia to have him arrested. So we were hoping to have him arrested and him be extradited. So the individual was Grisaldino Carvajal, and we had sent provisional arrest warrants to Colombia to have him extradited back to the United States to stand trial. But once we sent the provisional arrest warrants through to Colombia, we heard back that he had been killed in a drive-by shooting. And Rocky and I were discussing that we were a little bit skeptical, that he had really been killed in Colombia and that he's possibly alive today. But I guess that's one thing that we'll never know about the case.
And also, Jerry, for your listeners, Tocayo is the Spanish word that means a namesake. So it means that the person that is called a Tocayo has the same first name. So it's possible that there was another Grisaldino, because he was Tocayo, that was also part of it, because it is a name that is referred to someone who shares the same name. But we were able to identify this Tocayo as the Grisaldino of Carvajal. But everyone knew that the team said they were sent by Tocayo, and Tocayo did come and stay at UB Ramirez's house along with the hit team. And UB Ramirez at the time allowed them to stay in her home. They had firearms. She allowed them to keep firearms. She drove them around. She had a car. She was also used as a ruse at the Bernie and Berto Gonzalez murders. She went in there. They were there to look at the sale of the boat. And they brought a female so that it would lower, his defense and he won't feel threatened or what have you. And she drove there, came out of the car, and she did, according to her, did not expect that they were going to kill him. They thought that they were just going to do a robbery. But she knew that she was going there to commit a crime and help them commit a crime. So she was charged. And unfortunately, she was offered a plea, but, she ended up getting convicted and getting the same sentence as the other individuals. And she appealed. And unfortunately, whatever happened, whether it be attorney ego that they could win the case or defense attorney against prosecutor, whatever happened, that plea, according to her, was never brought to her. And if it was, she would have accepted the 5-year plea. And instead, she ended up getting life. So on appeal, she did win the appeal and she did get out of prison. And we all felt that, she distanced herself from the organization. This happened in the early 90s. She had lived a regular life with a job. She had a family. And it did not look like she was involved in any of the drug trafficking anymore. And, basically she was just caught up in that limelight, which back in those days, working as a cop in the 80s, we went from homicide to homicide. It was just cocaine cowboys shooting up, bang, bang. We jumped from homicide to homicide back in then. Cocaine was everything back in the 80s and the 90s. So she was one of those caught up in the scene. And, being spoiled and money being spent. And she was young, very, very young at the time. And we just felt that, a life sentence was a little too harsh for her. But, she had her attorney. But she did win her appeal, and she ended up getting out after 5 years.
Well, good for her, because that's really what we care about is justice. And if that was the appropriate sentence for her, then good for her. All right. So you were saying that this case is broken down into other areas. So what's the next area that you want to talk about?
Yes, Jerry, I want to talk about the jury tampering part of the investigation. And of course, that was one of the most important parts of the FBI investigation, because we hadn't seen jury tampering case of this magnitude. I guess something similar could have been the mob cases in New York City, like the Gotti case, where a few jurors were bribed, and which resulted in hung juries. But this was a case where more than 2 jurors were bribed, and it resulted in a full acquittal. So this was a very important case for law enforcement and for the U.S. Attorney's Office. And as I mentioned earlier, my good friend Mike Anderson was the lead case agent, FBI case agent in this part of the investigation. And he worked along with the senior IRS agent, Dennis Donnell, and our forensic accountant, Jennifer Richardson. And they did an outstanding financial analysis of the money, of the bribe money that was paid to Moya. And I'm not going to go into detail about their financial investigation, because I know Mike already did an episode with you where he goes through the meticulous financial investigation that they conducted. But I do want to talk a little bit about how we selected Jack Garcia as the undercover agent. And Jerry, I know you know Jack Garcia from your times in the FBI. So at that point of the investigation, we had all the financial information we needed. We had Miguel Moya, dead to rights on unexplained wealth and spending money that he would not be able to explain. But we didn't have a way to prove that he accepted a bribe from the organization. So my brother is an FBI agent in New York at that time, was good friends with an undercover agent named Jack Garcia. And when I was speaking to my brother, about the case and what we were looking to do in the case, because I often called him and we discussed cases and bounced ideas off each other, he had mentioned this undercover agent that worked on his squad in the Brooklyn Queens RA, Jack Garcia. And he would be perfect in an undercover role for us because he's Cuban and he just does outstanding undercover work. So I reached out to Jack, who was in high demand at that time. He had been working on a number of Group 1s, but we were lucky in Miami that Jack has family in Miami. He enjoys traveling to Miami. So he was interested in doing an undercover role in the case. So Jack traveled to Miami to meet with the prosecutors and to meet with the agents. And as everybody knows who's worked with Jack, he's not just an undercover agent, but he just has a tremendous amount of experience, and he has great ideas on different things to do to solicit statements from subjects in investigations. So Jack was actually, along with Mike Clemens and the prosecutors, came up with this scenario to approach Mike Moya as he was leaving work. So I'm not going to go into all the details of that undercover meeting because that's been covered by my good friend, Mike Anderson. But needless to say, I was in a van, Jerry, right next to where Jack Garcia and Miguel Moya were meeting. And initially the meeting was not going well, but in the end, Jack was able to get the admissions that we were looking for. And we were extremely happy after that meeting between Jack and Moya, because now we knew we had sufficient evidence to charge him in the case. And once we had all that evidence, then that resulted in the arrest of Miguel Moya. When he was approached, he did not cooperate in the investigation. And that resulted in the first trial that went to trial in January 1999. And I do want to talk about that trial a little bit, Jerry, because in the Netflix series, defense counsel talks about a brilliant defense that was put on during that trial. And if your listeners haven't seen the Netflix special or heard Mike's podcast, Moya had to come up with an explanation for the money that he spent, because following the trial, the FBI was able to track over $500,000 in spending. And we're able also to show that he had spent tremendous amounts of cash also following the trial. So we had the tape with Jack Garcia, and we had all the financial evidence against us. It was a very strong case. So defense counsel decided to bring in an individual called Ray Perez. And Ray Perez was part of a famous public corruption investigation. In fact, Pat Sullivan was the prosecutor on that case called the Miami River Cops. And that was a case worked by Miami-Dade Police Department, U.S. Attorney's Office, and federal investigators. And that was a group of very corrupt officers, the city of Miami Police Department, hired in the 80s. At that time, there was a tremendous amount of drug trafficking going on in Miami. And I believe the backstory was that the city of Miami was going to lose some funding, some federal funding. So they rushed through some hires without doing proper background checks on the officers. And there was a very corrupt group of officers called the Miami River Cops. And Moya's cousin, Ray Perez, was one of those convicted dirty cops, convicted in that investigation. So defense counsel brought him in to testify during that case. And I was present for most of that trial. His testimony, I believe, was completely rejected by the jury. Our prosecutor, Ed Nucci, really destroyed him on the stand. So I don't think that anybody on the jury really believed that the money that Moya was spending was money provided to him by Ray Perez when he was involved in drug trafficking in the late 80s and early 90s. But to their credit, that defense was a surprise to the government, and it did cause some confusion. I know that Judge King was not happy with that defense, but overall, I believe that the jury did not buy that story being told by a corrupt police officer. I think what happened in the case that caused the hung jury, there was one juror on the jury who believed that the FBI possibly had doctored the tape, which was the tape of a meeting between Jack Garcia and Moya, which is an important part of the case. So that caused a little bit of confusion in the jury room, that he thought that the tape may have been tampered with. But I don't really think the Ray Perez testimony had much to do with the jury not being able to come up with a verdict in that case. And it was not a majority of jurors who were voting not guilty. It was just one or maybe two on the jury. So I tend to disagree that that was a brilliant defense put on for the case. And the end result, Jerry, was after that hung jury, the prosecutors, Ed Nucci, Julie Paler, and David Buckner, quickly went back to work, and they tried him again about 3 or 4 months later, because I think it was around July 1999. And then Moya was convicted in the second trial. And then he was sentenced to close to 20 years in that case. And Moya never cooperated with the government throughout the whole case, and he ended up doing his time in that case. And following the conviction of Moya after the July trial, there was a large celebration that went on at Tobacco Road. And Tobacco Road was a local bar, it's one of the oldest bars in Miami. It was near the U.S. Attorney's Office that prosecutors and agents would go to a lot to celebrate big victories. And there was a large number of agents and prosecutors all present at Tobacco Road after that verdict. And I do remember that Julie Paler, one of the prosecutors, received a call from the Attorney General, Janet Reno, at that time. And she had been following the case very closely because Janet Reno was the former state attorney in Miami. So I know Julie was surprised to get that call. And I think she ended up then putting Ed Nucci on the phone to talk to the Attorney General. And that was a good time in the case. We had a lot of setbacks in the case, but this was finally a really good victory for the government. It was a very good celebration for everybody at Tobacco Road on the case.
Yeah, I would imagine after the earlier disappointments of the DEA case, and then after the first trial and hung jury in the Moya case, that, yeah, everybody is relieved and really excited about the victory and actually getting a conviction this time.
Yes, like I said, it was very satisfying after all the investigation done on the case to get a guilty verdict on Miguel Moya and a lengthy sentence as well. So he would pay for his crimes in the case. And then, Jerry, following the Moya conviction, the jury tampering investigation continued because we always suspected it was not just Miguel Moya. How could one juror convince all 12 to come up with a not guilty verdict? So we always suspected that there were other jurors involved in getting that not guilty verdict. And we had information from different witnesses that maybe Jose Fernandez, an individual associated with Sal Magluta, was involved in bribing one of the jurors. We just didn't know who it was. Now, Jose Fernandez was an individual involved in the real estate business, and he would buy properties, rent properties, and do different real estate transactions and money laundering transactions for the organization. So he was on our radar for a long time. And then following the Moya conviction, the investigation continued, and Jose Fernandez was subsequently indicted in the case on money laundering charges and other charges. And Jose Fernandez, like others, like I had discussed when we go through the process, was approached, would not cooperate. Then we moved to the arrest and indictment phase. And again, we try to move as quickly as possible to the trial phase. And then Jose Fernandez went to trial and he's convicted. So once he's convicted at trial, Jerry, of course, he's looking at a lengthy prison sentence. So he reaches out through his counsel to say he wants to cooperate now. And he has information regarding the jury tampering part of the FBI investigation. So following his conviction, we end up meeting with Jose Fernandez, and he provides information regarding another juror that he had paid named Gloria Alba, and another individual who worked with him in the real estate business named Raul Saraf. And Raul had come up on our radar previously because we knew of his associations to Gloria Alba, and he had gone to school with, I think he went to junior high school with Sal Magluta. So to our surprise, we weren't sure at the time when we first started talking to Jose Fernandez who was the juror that he paid off. And we showed him a few photo arrays, and then he picked out Gloria Alba. So a few of the investigators had suspected Gloria Alba. I think Dennis Donnell may have suspected her involvement, but some of the agents didn't think that she'd been involved because she'd been interviewed, Jerry, about the trial, and she gave a very good overview of what went on in jury deliberations, and she was never suspected of being involved in the jury tampering. So once we had that information from Jose Fernandez, and he identified Gloria Alba, one of the other jurors in the case, then it was time for myself and Dennis Donnell to approach Raul Saraf and solicit his cooperation. And in this case, with Raul Saraf, he did agree to cooperate right from the beginning, from the initial time that he was approached. And then he agreed to make consensual recordings against Gloria Alba. So we were saying to ourselves, well, this trial was in 1996, and Gloria Alba hasn't received payments in so long. Now we're in 2002. Would she be receptive to getting a call from Raul Saraf? And to our surprise, the initial call, Raul Saraf calls Gloria Alba and says, "Hello, Gloria. How are you? I haven't spoken to you in so many years. I just wanted to let you know I recently met with organization members from the Falcon Magluta organization, and they wanted to thank you for keeping quiet, all these years about the money that I had paid to you and all that, and that they wanted to reward you and pay you some of the money that was owed to you, because Gloria Alba felt that she got shortchanged, because the original agreement was that if it was a hung jury, she would get somewhere in the area of around $300,000. But if it was a not guilty verdict, she was going to get $1 million. And that was what was in her mind. She was owed $1 million. But following the acquittal, Salvador Magluta was very smart. He's like, well, why am I going to pay this lady $700,000 when I already have the acquittal, what is she going to do? Go to the police and report this? Of course not. She's already taken $300,000. So of course she's not going to come to the police.
Jose is going to approach her. Hasn't she been listening and doesn't she know about Moya having been charged and convicted? Isn't she suspicious?
Yes, that's what we initially thought, Jerry, that this was going to be, a fishing expedition, that she was really not going to speak to Raul Saraf because she had seen Moya had already been convicted. But I think she felt that she had already been, interviewed by the FBI. It had been around 4 or 5 years since she'd been contacted, since she'd taken this money. So I think she believed she was in the clear at this point. And greed makes people do dumb things in life. So she was greedy and she wanted that extra money.
She should have looked at herself as being lucky.
Right. She had never been convicted. She should have kept that $300,000 and been happy with the $300,000. But obviously we were very happy. And now she's receptive to meeting. We told her we're going to give her some more money. So during the initial meeting, we had a hidden camera and recording devices on Raul Saraf, and they met at a restaurant in South Miami. Actually, they met in a parking lot outside of a restaurant in his vehicle for the first meeting. A subsequent meeting was in the restaurant. And again, Jerry, I tell you, we were shocked that she was very aggressive and she wanted that money. She believed that she did her job, and the agreement was that she was supposed to get $1 million bribe. So we had Raul Saraf give her $25,000 cash as, just a token of appreciation, and that she'd be getting the money later. So we had, undercover funds at that time. So we paid her the $25,000, and then we had that on film, and we had the audio recordings. We had everything. So we were very happy. Now we had Gloria Alba, but we knew that her ex-husband, Isael, was also involved in the conspiracy, and they had separated at that time. So we tried to figure out how could we get a meeting with Isael. So we decided to have Raul tell Gloria in a subsequent meeting that, hey, we're going to be giving you some more money, but the organization wants to make sure that you stay quiet, and we want to make sure that your husband, your ex-husband, hasn't told anybody about this, that it's just the two of you that know about the bribery scheme. So we were successfully able to get Isael then at a subsequent meeting at a restaurant. And during that meeting, we told them we're going to give them additional money. The full $1 million would be coming, but we're going to give them $50,000 now to start. But of course, as you know, Jerry, the FBI we don't like to let money walk. This was FBI undercover money. So we had already let $25,000 walk, and God knows she had probably already spent that before these other meetings. So the FBI said, you know what we're going to do then after this second meeting is we're going to give them the cash. And once the cash is exchanged, then we want you guys to take the case down and arrest them and take them into custody. So that's what we decided to do. And the FBI, we had assistance from Miami-Dade detectives. My good friend Felix Jimenez and his detectives were with us during this other meeting at the restaurant. They did the money exchange, and once they came out to the parking lot, then the arrest teams took them down and arrested them. And the unique thing about that arrest was that Pat Sullivan had asked, as a prosecutor, he wanted to be present for these arrests. And we usually don't bring the prosecutors on arrests, but Pat felt, that he wanted to be there. And he wanted to be present when Gloria was taken into custody. So we made sure to keep Pat back, away from the arrest scene. Once we had him in custody, we always want to keep our prosecutors safe. Once we had them in custody, then we brought Pat forward. And the expression on Gloria's face when she saw Pat was priceless. So she knew that the gig was up. We brought her back to the FBI office, her and her husband, and they quickly both confessed and agreed to cooperate with the investigation. And I remember telling Gloria, well, you're in a tough situation here, I said, because if you don't have any further information of value for us, then really we're just going to have to take you off to jail now. And then there's going to be no further opportunity for you to cooperate. And that's when she brought up that there was another juror, Maria Penalvar, who she suspected also took money because Maria Penovar was always with Miguel Moya. And during the trial, she had been spending some money, and she had a job where she didn't make a lot of money. And during the trial, she was spending some money that Gloria thought was very suspicious.
Had you had any idea or any thoughts that she may have also been compromised?
Yes, she was on the radar screen of law enforcement along with other jurors. She was more on the radar screen than Gloria Alba. So it was not a surprise to us when Gloria mentioned Maria. So what we decided to do at that point was try and do recorded conversations between Gloria and Maria. But at that point, Maria, it had been years, and Maria was not of the same mindset of Gloria, and she had no interest in speaking about her days on the jury or any money being spent. And we even had Gloria, admit to her that she took money and come on, I know you took money. How did it work? How did you get your money? But Maria was not receptive to talking to Gloria about it. So the last step of that part of the investigation was we decided to do approaches of Maria as she was coming out of work, and a simultaneous approach was going to be conducted by Felix Jimenez's group and his detectives. They were going to approach her boyfriend, Gerald Rodriguez, as he came out of work. And we simultaneously did interviews of both of them, one at the Miami-Dade offices and one at the FBI offices. And initially, both of them denied receiving any money or spending any money or anything like that. Both of them subsequently agreed to polygraph examinations. And our polygraph examiner was Scott Wegman, who I know Mike Anderson mentioned in his episode. Scott Wegman was a very experienced polygraph examiner. He'd worked on many major cases over the years. He was a great asset to our case. And following his interview, Maria provided a confession that she had taken the money. And then simultaneously, Gerald also provided a confession to Miami-Dade PD detectives. So at that point, Jerry, we had 3 jurors that we knew received bribe payments. Now, we suspect there were others. I'm not going to name them, obviously, because the evidence never reached a level where we could charge any of them. But there was definitely more than those 3 that were involved in the bribery scheme. We thought as we continued the investigation, we might develop more information to implicate these other jurors, but they were not as careless as the jurors that were convicted with their spending of money. We did follow-up financial investigations. We did some follow-up interviews, but unfortunately we had to end it at those 3. But that was a historic corruption of the jury that I don't think had been seen in a case before, and ended with at least we were able to convict 3 of the jurors and get some justice in the case.
And I guess that made the difference in this being an acquittal instead of a hung jury. It's because there were so many people being corrupted. And you're talking about something really bold for them to approach so many people, and not one of them came to prosecutors and said, I've been contacted by people on the other side. Not one of them.
Yeah, and to their credit, Jerry, one of the jurors did come forward to the U.S. Attorney's office and was interviewed. And
with suspicions that others may have been compromised, but not that he had been approached.
Right. They came after the fact, not during the trial.
Right. Not during the trial. And Jerry, if I think he had to do all over again, all he had to do was go to the judge and say, Your Honor, I asked for a private meeting. I mean, it would have been unusual, the judge didn't want to meet with the juror, but this was an unusual circumstance. I mean, you had a jury foreman in there that was adamantly, an advocate for the defendants. And he even said to one of the jurors during the deliberations, it was one of the last 2 holdouts, he said to the last 2 holdouts, hey, you 2 are the last 2 holdouts. You've seen all the murders in this case, people being killed. Don't you guys have families? Don't you know that they're going to know it was you if this is a hung jury? Like, just come along with the rest of us and we can get out of here. We can go home. It was a sequestered jury at that time for the deliberations. So Just that alone, those statements by Miguel Moya, basically threatening these jurors, they should have immediately said, we want a meeting with the judge. This jury foreman is threatening us. We believe that these defendants are guilty. So this jury foreman is not allowing us to deliberate, and he's not even deliberating. He was not deliberating during the trial. All he was doing was pushing for an acquittal, and then one by one, convincing each juror on the acquittal. So he earned his money. We only were able to catch him for $500,000. We know he took a lot more than $500,000. And I hope he enjoyed his money because he ended up doing close to 20 years in jail. I hope it was worth it, all the time he spent in jail. But that travesty of justice should have never happened. And I know these are regular citizens, we expect a lot from them. You put them on a jury like this. And, they're a bit overwhelmed because they're regular citizens, from the community. But I think a lot of them felt guilty afterwards that went along with the Moya scheme. So it was extremely satisfying that at least we were able to convict 3 of the jurors. And I think the whole team, the prosecutors and the investigators, we wish we would have convicted more of them that were involved in the scheme because we suspect that there were more. But based on the evidence and the investigation, those were the only 3 we could convict.
So, Rocky, I know you were basically the lead when it came to the murders and the homicides, but did you have a role in the jury tampering part? And what are your thoughts on this part of the case?
I had a role. I was the undercover agent that went to the Miami Heat game with Moya and another agent from our office, where Mike Anderson does explain in his recording how they were able to get him tickets to a Miami Heat game under a ruse, and then tickets for me and another agent to sit next to them to try to engage in conversations and see if we get any incriminating evidence. So I was at that game, and afterwards we did meet up again. And, I would make comments about, oh, wow, that's a nice Rolex, or, different conversations we'd have. And he, so it would come out on tape, okay, he's wearing a Rolex, so we know he has a Rolex. How did he pay for that? And he did, brag about having placed in the keys. And so he did make some admissions to it. And then we did meet on another occasion, but this time he was with his cousin Ray, and Ray was very standoffish, very uncomfortable. And Ray was very careful. He didn't speak much, and he just felt that he was very uncomfortable. And then so the next time I went out with another FBI agent, and we went to a club in South Beach, restaurant, ate, danced. I know there was agents in the club, and they were like, is this ever going to end? And, he started getting a little touchy, and what have you. But, I've been in nightclubs before in Miami. So, women know how to kind of get away from that kind of situation. And it got to a point where obviously any other further meetings were going to lead to something else. So that's when we decided, okay, we need to have another approach. And that's when the whole Jack Garcia came up, that idea to have him approach that way. But he did make some incriminating statements of things that he owned that were helpful. And then the defense team tried to make it seem like the FBI did a unbelievable evil thing of using a woman to entice in a manner that was like so unprofessional and what have you.
Using your feminine wiles.
Yeah, they coined me as the dirty dancer. I mean, it was a newspaper article, but it didn't have my name in it. But it was funny how they, said that the FBI sicked an attractive woman onto him, and underneath my low-cut top, I had a recording. They didn't have no idea what recording devices we were using, and they were just making this stuff up in court, saying that I used the whole dirty dancing to entice him into making some incriminating statements. And that wasn't true.
And were you cross-examined during that trial?
No, we're fighting to get me to testify, but I was not in a position to testify as I was pregnant and about to. Their circumstances medically kept me out of the courtroom. So I never did have to testify in that case. They were able to bring the tapes in by the person who was monitoring them. Yeah.
Very interesting.
And just for the record, Jerry, the case agents on the case, we did not instruct Agent Cicini to conduct dirty dancing with Malia at the nightclub in South Beach.
Yes, I remember afterwards, it was like, oh my God, you can dance. And they wanted to go home. It was late and everything. After working in the office and then coming in and working, it was like that.
They thought you were having too much fun, right?
Yeah. And also the other female agent that was with me, they kept buying us mojitos. They kept buying us drinks and what have you, but we wouldn't drink it. When they weren't looking, we would pour some of the cocktail out into a planter that was next to us. And she and I had this joke because we would laugh, because they would turn around and it looked like we were drinking, but we never drank any of the alcohol that they kept buying because we kept dumping it. They tried to say that, we were inebriated, just lies. Yeah, it was a fun night. And then Mario pulled the plug. My husband's an FBI agent in Miami. And he was like, oh, I better pull her back before something happens.
Yeah, like we know that female agents can handle themselves and they're professionals, but we still, we have sisters and mothers and all that. So we're very protective of our female counterparts. We didn't think we were going to get the results that we wanted in this case. And then we quickly shifted over to the Jack Garcia scenario, which was very successful.
Excellent. We'll continue the rest of this review next week in part 2. And that's the end of part 1 of this 2-part episode. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes on my website where you'll see photos of Mario Tariche and Rocky Cicini, plus lots of links to news articles about this case and case-related images. There's also a link to episode 134 with Mike Anderson, who reviews the Michael Moya jewelry bribery portion of this case. Now, sometimes Apple Podcasts doesn't list episode numbers, so you might need to look up episode 134 by the original date it was posted, September 20th, 2018. I've added new images to the show notes for episode 134 on my website. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.